Hi everyone, this is a demo for exercise number 1, which is color mixing. So I'm mostly going to be following the instructions on this assignment sheet. But the goal of this exercise is to just experiment with mixing paint on your palette and blending and mixing paint on your piece of paper or your canvas as well. And as with all exercises, the more that you just kind of experiment with things, don't worry about mistakes, try new things, the better, the more you're going to learn. So the goal really is experimentation, not creating something perfect. Okay, so first things first, gather all the things that you need. So you need your palette. We're working with disposable palettes, which are wonderful. When you're done, you just tear it off and throw it away. You'll need something to paint on. So if you're in class, we'll have a piece of watercolor paper, but it can be a canvas. This is canvas paper because it's whatever I had at home. You'll need your acrylic paints. I'll go into which paints in just a little bit. A tub of water, a variety of paintbrushes. Again, this is all about experimentation. So, having different sizes is a great way to experiment with painting. Paper towel, and then we'll also be experimenting with a couple different mediums for mixing into the paint. So the paints that I have today are traditional color wheel paints. We are not doing a traditional color wheel, but we're kind of doing something with the same goals. So I have two different kinds of red. I have alizarin crimson and I have cadmium red light. If you look at these, you'll notice that alizarin crimson tends a little more towards purple or pink, and the cadmium red tends a little bit more towards orange. And that's kind of what you're paying attention for if you think of the color wheel. Again, I have two different kinds of yellow. I have cadmium yellow medium and cadmium yellow light. You'll notice the yellow light tends a little more towards green, and the medium tends a little more towards orange. And then I have two blues. I have ultramarine blue and I have Prussian blue. The ultramarine tends towards purple. The Prussian tends towards green. I have titanium white. I have ivory black, and I have Payne's gray. The two mediums that we're working with today. Now, medium, basically what that means is it's the liquid, essentially, that you put your pigment into. So acrylic paints are already pigment in an acrylic medium, but these are ways to kind of create different textures or add different qualities to your paint. So we're working with a gloss medium, which will both make your paint more transparent and add a little bit of a glossy nature to your paint. And we'll also be working with an acrylic retarder, which what this does, any medium will make your paint a little bit more transparent, but the goal of this is to slow the dry time on your paint. So if you're mixing paints, even both on your palette, but on your paper, having a slower dry time just allows you more time to blend, allows you more time to kind of fiddle around with things. Acrylic paint dries really quick, and that can be really frustrating. So I just always love putting as much retarder in as possible, unless you're working in a process that is good for the paint to dry quickly. But the first painting we're doing with the slower the dry time, the more control you have. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to lay out my paints and my mediums kind of around the edge of my palette so that I'm ready to mix. You'll notice that I'm not going to do a giant amount. I'm going to do kind of I don't know, is that a thumb size blob to start with? And that should be fine for this mixing, this exercise. Again, the goal of this exercise is to kind of get to know the paint. So if you end up needing more paint, that's fine. If you don't use all your paint, as long as you haven't squeezed the whole tube out, that should be fine. and then as you kind of, with the different projects, you'll sort of understand like, oh, I have the different different needs for different amounts of paints, and you'll get a better sense for that as you keep painting. Okay, so I've got all the paints on my palette. You'll notice that some paints, once you put them on the palette, start to look really similar to each other. For example, this is Prussian blue. Otherwise, the version we would be working with in class is phthalo blue. This is ivory black, and this is Payne's gray. They all have different qualities when you actually paint them out, so you want to kind of pay attention to what's what. You'll also notice that sometimes the white paint and the gloss medium look really similar. In class, we'll be working with a more heavy body gloss medium, so it looks really similar to the white paint, but they have very different qualities. And the retarder can also sometimes look similar to the gloss medium or even the white. So just paying attention to like knowing what colors you put where can really matter. And you can always test them out on your palette or a scratch piece of paper if you, for some reason, if you forget, if you kind of paint it out, you can see. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start mixing. So we're going to experiment with mixing on our palette and then using that paint to paint on the paper. The reason it's important to experiment with color mixing is that while we have a lot of colors in tubes, we don't have all the colors in tubes, and knowing how to get the color that you actually want is really important. Now, when we were collecting our materials, I forgot to add that you're going to need a palette knife because that is what we use to mix on the palette. So the first thing I want to do is mix a perfect red, quote unquote. How do we know what a perfect red is? It's kind of up to you. But if you look at the two reds I have, one is definitely like, that's super pink, that one's super orange. And so I want something in the middle. So I'm just gonna grab kind of a chunk of each paint, put it down. Now you'll notice that because I didn't clean my palette knife off, I got some of that orange red into the pinky red. I'm not too worried because I know that I'm gonna be mixing these two together today. But that would start to like really matter if I'm then going into white or if I'm going into the yellow, because the red will really affect the quality, the purity of those colors. So if you're diving into a pure color and you don't want to mess it up, just make sure you wipe off your palette knife in between things. Since I'm mixing these two reds, I don't need to wipe it off quite yet. So then when I mix on my palette, you're just kind of like mushing it around. It's a little bit like kneading bread. I don't know. You're trying to get it so that everything is mixed and there's no more streaks of one color or the other. And then as I'm mixing, I'm going to sort of evaluate. Do I think this is a good red? This still feels a little bit orangey to me. So I'm going to grab a little bit more of the pinky red and put that in. And you'll notice that some paints have a little more potency than other paints. Like, so for example, when you're mixing with yellow, sometimes you need to add more yellow. Or if you're mixing with black, you don't need to add very much black at all. But that looks like a really good red to me. Now, a little bit about palette knife and brush care. If you put it down and you're not using it, acrylic paint dries really quickly, and once it dries on the palette knife or the brush, you've essentially ruined it because it's permanent, it's really hard to get off. So while it's still wet, you either want to clean it right away, or if you're not going to clean it right away, just stick it in your water. You don't want to leave a paintbrush down for like a whole day or especially more than a day, but just for a little bit while you're in the midst of things. And then when you're ready to clean it with the palette knife, you just wipe it off with your paper towel. And then now you'll notice that paper towel, I don't want to dip anything in that part. So sometimes you do go through a lot of paper towels. So now that I've got my perfect red, I just want to do a circle somewhere on my paper. It doesn't matter. And I've got a variety of paintbrushes, and I want to experiment with using small paintbrushes and bigger paintbrushes. And I'm also going to experiment with like how much water I want to add. This is heavy body acrylic. It's really gloopy, and a little bit of water helps just kind of smooth it out when you're painting. Because again, we're going to try to get a circle that has clean edges and smooth paint. So I'm going to start with my smaller brush, and I'm going to add just like a few drops of water and kind of mix it in until it feels like, oh, this is like a nice consistency for painting. And then I'm just going to do, it doesn't need to be big, but don't make it too small. I'm going to do a circle, and I'm just freehanding this. It does not need to be perfect. But again, I'm trying to make like a clean edge. So having the paint be a little bit, have a little bit of water in it. So you notice sometimes the edge gets a little raggedy. And then I want to make sure I don't have any bumps, because when acrylic paint dries, if it's got bumps, it's really annoying. So if you, when you put your brush in the water, if you have too much brush, that's where your paper towel comes in, or too much water, not too much brush. If you have too much water on your brush, you can always double check with a paper towel to make sure your brush is clean, but also just like get off that excess water. But again, I want to add just a tiny bit of water. And I'm gonna then fill in my circle as smooth as possible. So sometimes I need to reload. If I have too much paint, then I get kind of that bloppy, streaky paint, and it's hard to control. If I have too much water, then it gets really thin and kind of, if your canvas is tilted in a direction, it'll start to drip. So you can see it's like starting to drip right there. So it really is kind of about finding that happy Goldilocks medium. And then I'm just cleaning out my paintbrush. Now, one thing you'll notice is that even with my perfectly painted circle, it's a little bit streaky. And acrylic paint, different kinds of paint have different levels of opacity. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to keep this red on my palette. I'm going to let this dry. And when this dries completely, so it's no longer shiny, some of it is already dry, I'm going to do another layer over the top, and that'll make it feel more smooth and more flat. While I'm waiting though, I'm going to take my palette knife and I'm going to use this red, and I'm going to make 3 new swatches, one with white, one with black, and one with Payne's gray. And so I want to kind of pay attention to what I'm mixing. So I'm going to just pull some from here and mix it up. And this is called mixing values. You're making your colors lighter or darker. And when we talk about value in art, we're talking about relative light and dark. Okay, so now I've mixed my values. One is with white. And again, like these are not, my demos are not perfect. So there's a little bit of streakiness left in some of these paints. So I'm going to try to avoid the streaks. But this one is mixed with white, goes lighter. This one is mixed with a little bit of black, goes darker. This one is mixed with a little bit of Payne's gray, also goes darker. I was trying to use equal amount of Payne's gray and black, and I accidentally used a little bit more Payne's gray than I intended. So normally black is a little more intense than Payne's gray, but it's a little harder to notice here. But again, the more you experiment, the more you'll sort of see. Payne's gray tends a little blue, black tends a little bit more brown. But then also I think we'll notice it as we paint it out. We may not, and in which case then great. Like ultimately the goal is that you can get the color that you want to get. Whatever you use to get there is kind of irrelevant, as long as you get what you want to get. Okay, so first off, I'm gonna do another layer with the same colors on this. So there's still a little bit of water on here. It kind of feels like too much water, so I'm gonna try to offload some water and onload some paint. And then just kind of very carefully going to the edge, but without ruining my edge. And trying not to make any bumps. If I needed to kind of reestablish my edge, I could pick up that smaller brush again. Like you know, if you're doing a flat shape, then I really like doing the edges first and then filling in the middle. There we go, kind of clean up some of those edges. But then there, so you can see that suddenly it looks less streaky. It looks more just flat red, kind of that perfect red circle we were going for. So I'm going to do the same thing with the other colors just to kind of see what they look like. So I'm going to make sure when you're switching colors, I like to take my brush and kind of just wipe it along the bottom, and then I find a clean piece of paper towel and make sure that it's rubbing clean. If there was still red on this, I'd go back in and I'd rub it on the bottom of my water and then come back and clean it out. But I want just a tiny bit of water. Again, because the paint is kind of gloopy, so I'm gonna do just a white one next to it. There's no particular order you need things. But I've got a lot of paint on my paintbrush, and it means that like the stuff on the edges is kind of making a bump. So I'm gonna wanna make sure I come back in while that's wet, and I'm gonna use a kind of a different size paintbrush. Again, the more you experiment with paintbrushes, the better. And I didn't add very much to this because there was some paint left over. So I'm just gonna try to see what happens to make it smooth. Clean out that paintbrush, come back to my smaller paintbrush, and then we'll do the one with the black. And that means, because it's kind of running rough, I'm gonna add just a tiny bit more water. So just experiment with how much water feels like too much water, how much paint on the brush feels like too much paint, and that's where your paper towel is. Anytime you need to kind of offload, get it off on your paper towel, and then when your paper towel is full, just throw it away and find a new paper towel. And since this is small, I'm just going to use this brush to paint it in. But because it's smaller, it's actually harder for me to make it smoother because I am making more streaks with the smaller brush. It's easier to do some of those details, oops, like the edge, like a clean edge. It's harder to fill in a larger space and make it feel smooth. Come back, see if I can reestablish that edge. And of course, the more water I add, the more transparent it gets, so the more likely it is to be streaky. So there's a lot of qualities you're kind of holding in balance while you do this. Okay. And then I'll do the one with the Payne's Gray. We'll see if that looks any different. May have added a little bit too much water to this one, and that's okay. I'm experimenting, so I can add a little more paint, kind of mix it around, but it is making this a little bit more streaky. Right now it's pretty hard to tell the qualities depending on quantity of what you add. Sometimes the Payne's Gray can tend a little bluer, and it's a little less potent than the black. So I feel like as it dries, you might see this one turns a little bit more red, but it's gonna be subtle. Okay, so that was kind of a classic color wheel practice of mixing a perfect red, mixing these, like how do you get that smooth edge? How do you get that smooth painting? So the next thing we're gonna do is experiment with mixing with the mediums. So I'm just gonna, what we're gonna do is we're gonna make kind of the perfect orange. So we're gonna start by doing what we did there, but then we're gonna mix some medium into it. So if I'm mixing orange, remember this red tends towards purple, this yellow tends towards green. So these two are gonna make a pretty ugly orange, but this yellow tends towards orange and this red tends towards orange. So they're both leaning in the same direction. So those are the two that I wanna mix to make the perfect orange. And again, I don't want to get red in my yellow, so I'm going to wipe the palette knife off. I'm going to start mixing. And you'll notice as you mix like different colors even more, you got to make sure you mix it so you don't get those streaks. Those could be really annoying if you get that when you're painting. Okay, what do we think? I think it could use a little more yellow. So I'm gonna wipe off my palette knife one more time. Go into that yellow. So I'm going to switch up paintbrushes just for fun. And I'm going to do an orange circle just with this straight acrylic paint orange and maybe a little bit of water. Again, if you have a defined shape, it's easier to actually do the edges first and then fill in the middle, but that looks pretty good. That's a decent orange. Then what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take my palette knife and I'm gonna take some of this and I'm gonna mix in, oops, should have cleaned my palette knife. Now my gloss medium is orange on right there. I'm gonna mix in some of that gloss medium. And you'll find that when you're painting with the gloss medium, you may or may not need to add as much water and the retarder. So those kind of start to affect the paintability of those. So this is the gloss medium, so I'm going to do another circle. You know what? I'm going to make sure I do that edge and then paint in the middle because it just is so much easier. Oops. Sometimes when you bring it out, there can be a drip of water on here and it'll drip down and really mess with you. So watch out that you clean those off. Okay, so we're going to do the edge first. fill in the middle. Clean those off, come back, and we're gonna mix this with some of the retarder. Okay, now these 3 oranges look pretty similar, so the question is, but why do we do that? What's the point? So this first one, you'll notice the straight paint is more opaque than when you add either medium to it. So that's something to think of. Like sometimes you want a more transparent paint and sometimes you want a more opaque paint. So the more medium you add, the more transparent it is. As it gets more transparent, you notice it gets more streaky. So that is a quality that just kind of happens. One thing that you'll notice as it dries is this is pretty dry already. Like if I go like this, I'm not really, I'm getting a little bit of paint, but it appears to be wet because it's got that gloss medium, so it's shinier. This one has a few bits of shine, but that's actually just where it's still wet paint. The retarder, what you'll notice, what is lovely about the retarder is that these have dried really quickly, right? I'm drawing a dry brush across them and it's not doing anything because acrylic paint dries really quickly. And even as I was doing this one, as I was trying to blend it, some of the stuff in the middle was starting to dry already, and I was you kind of feel it pulling against you and you can no longer blend it. The retarder, it's been sitting there, but it's just, it's drying. I didn't put a ton of retarder in there, but it's more, it's still more mixable. I can start, if I want to kind of soften that edge, I can kind of blend that edge out a little bit more. I can pull the paint and I can kind of make things a little bit softer, and I'm just using this dry brush to kind of blend it out and just work it. And because it has that retarder in it, I can just work it a lot nicer because the paint just stays wet longer. Also, what's nice is that your paint stays wet longer on the palette. So you'll notice some of these paints kind of sitting out here. This paint right here, in the middle where there's like a lot of it, it's still kind of wet, but on the edge, like it's already dried. Like I can't use some of this paint that I've mixed up because it's dried. This stuff with the retarder on it will stay wet a lot longer, so it's a lot more usable. If I wanted to come back to this perfect orange in like 2 hours, there's no way I could use any of these paints in 2 hours. I might need to mix a little bit more retarder in, but I might still be able to use that orange. So if I've mixed up the perfect orange and know I'm going to be coming back to it a lot, then I've got that. The other nice thing, so this is kind of mixing mediums on the palette. Mediums allow you to mix on, oops, got a little bit of water there. So watch out if you drip water on there. Once it really, really dries, water won't do too much to it, but if it's still a little bit wet, water will lift the paint off. So now we're going to experiment with mediums for layering paint over the top of other paint on the canvas. Okay, so you noticed I've kind of run out of room on this palette. I could squish stuff in, but that can get dangerous if you start mixing paints. So the nice thing about the disposable palettes is you can like carefully, if you still have paint that you want to use on one, you can carefully tear off that layer, put it on the table, and then have a clean layer to keep kind of expanding your palette, so to speak. All right, so what we're gonna do now is we're gonna experiment with layering to mix color over the top of paint that has dried. So I wanna double check, I'm gonna layer over this red paint. And I wanna make sure when I'm doing layering like this, that I have let the paint dry completely. So this is where like the fast dry time of acrylic paint is nice. When you're doing layers, if the paint is wet underneath, you sort of pick that paint back up. And sometimes if you're trying to blend on your piece of paper, that's really nice. Sometimes if you're trying to layer, then that can be really frustrating. So I'm gonna make sure my palette knife is clean. Great. And then I'm just gonna grab some yellow. And I'm gonna do mostly that light yellow, but a little bit of the medium yellow. And I'm just gonna mix it together. And then I'm gonna mix both of these mediums in. So I'm gonna try not to get too much paint in my mediums. So I'm gonna mix a lot of gloss medium and just a little bit of retarder. So you notice I picked up a tiny bit of that orange. It should mostly disappear into the yellow, but that is a dangerous thing that I'm doing. So anyways, okay, so I'm mixing the mediums in, a lot of gloss medium, a little bit of retarder. And because it has so much gloss medium, I don't think I'll need to add as much water, but again, that's kind of totally up to you what sort of feel you like on the paint. I'll clean that off later. So I'm going to grab this paintbrush. Actually, let's do it with this bigger paintbrush because it makes it a little, the bigger paintbrush makes it easier to do kind of smoother. And I'm gonna just paint this yellow over the bottom half of each of these red circles. And I can kind of go over the top, and I just want it to be smoothly over that. A little bit more. Now what's tricky with the gloss medium is it's a little bit like glue in that as it dries, it gets more transparent. So we'll kind of come back to this and evaluate like what it looks like to mix colors on the canvas versus mixing on the palette, and see how that goes. But you can see already how the gloss medium has made the yellow super transparent. And then as it dries, we'll see more of that, and we can kind of look and see how the colors mixed by layering. Okay, the next thing we're gonna do, so this is the challenge, but this will actually make you more confident going into the first one, is trying to create some gradients. So I'm gonna start with a dark color. So I'm actually just gonna kind of mix the two blues together and make a dark blue. Okay, and into this blue, I want a lot of retarder and some gloss medium. But because I'm going to be kind of blending on the paper, the retarder will help slow everything down. And a little bit of gloss medium. All right, looks like I need a new paper towel. Okay, so I'm gonna clear off 2 brushes here. I'm mostly going to use this brush because it's a little bit softer. It's the white nylon brush that you'll be using mostly in the class. But I'm going to keep a brush that's kind of dry for, you'll notice when I have that dry brush to blend that, like essentially that's what we're trying to do. So I'm going to start by just doing some of the blue, and then I'm going to kind of pull it down. And you know, one thing I could have done to make it even more intense gradient is have a couple different, the very like pure blue, so it's more opaque, and then a blue with more medium, and then a blue with even more retarder and medium. But then I'm gonna kind of just experiment with pulling it down, and I'm gonna be adding some more water. I can add a little bit more medium to it. And I'm trying to make just a really super smooth gradient from blue into, and then I can, if I've got too much blue on my paintbrush, I can kind of pull into just that white paper. And then this is where coming back in with a drier, clean brush means you can kind of keep playing. If it's got that retarder in it, you can keep smoothing things out. And then I want to keep this brush kind of dry without like, so that it's not actually doing repainting, it's only moving the paint around here. And I'm just gonna kind of keep working it. Keep pulling some of this paint down there so that it just feels like a smooth gradient. If this feels like this has too much paint, you could take this, I could add a little bit of water. And this is where, if you're working with the watercolor paper, it might eventually just kind of get destroyed if you work it too hard, but the canvas. So I'm gonna lift up some of that paint, come back in with my dry brush and work that so it feels like it just kind of fades into that white really nicely. So the more retarder I use means the more I can work this. I'm kind of going back and forth between adding paint, but then using this dry brush without paint to move things around so that you're not like repainting each time. And whenever I do that, you want to make sure that brush stays dry and stays like it's not adding paint. And then kind of clean this off. It's hard to do though. It's tricky to make that perfect gradient. So after you do this gradient, the next challenge is to do a gradient from one color into the next. So essentially you're kind of going to do this twice and then work them together in the middle. So I'm going to start with, and you want to make sure that, again, you have a lot of retarder mixed in. But I know that I already have retarder in both of these. So I'm going to start with the yellow kind of pull that down. And then sort of clean off some of that and just add a little bit of retarder and a little bit of water and pull that down a little bit, making sure it's really important that you have the retarder in there until it kind of fades into nothing. I'm gonna clean that off and then come back with the blue on the other side. The more space you have to work with, the easier this is, the less space. Okay, and then I'm gonna get rid of that paint and come back in with a little bit of water, a little retarder, kind of pull that into here, and then hopefully kind of get those kind of as perfect as, oops, I lifted that too much. Get those as perfect as possible, and then come in with the dry brush, and I'm gonna fix this part first. So now I have blue on here, so I don't want to mess with that. So I might actually even get another brush and start to mix these two together, making sure to clean off so I'm not pulling it further than I want to. So kind of keep pulling that. And I've gone sort of extreme so that they don't mix too much, but I can kind of pull them a little bit more. And this brush is kind of a straggly brush, so it's actually not giving me as smooth a blend as I might have with a smoother brush. But sort of getting there. Yeah, so you can see how it starts to get that blend from yellow to blue and mixes into green in the middle. If I had more paint, then the green in the middle might be a more intense mix, which I could actually experiment. Let's see what happens when we put a little more paint on there. So instead of kind of fading out and then fading into green, let's see what happens when we bring these closer together. You'll notice I have to be more careful about how much blue I'm bringing into the yellow as opposed to how much yellow I'm bringing into the blue. So clean that off. I'll switch back to this one if I'm cleaning. Some gunk in there that's kind of being annoying. Get rid of that. There, it's getting there. It's not perfect, but it's getting there. And then the last, so after you do the gradients, the last step is to kind of experiment with, I had talked right at the beginning about what happens when you mix the wrong colors. So let's just kind of see what happens when you mix the wrong colors. So the wrong colors being, I talked about how this red tends towards purple, this red tends to, or this yellow tends towards green. So if we mix them together, it's not a very perfect orange. So you can see the difference between these two oranges. And if we paint, I'll paint it kind of right next to it. So you can see how that orange is duller. And again, we'll be able to see if we mix, so this blue tends towards purple and this yellow tends towards orange. So if we mix these two together, it's not going to be a very pretty green. So there's that green versus if we take the blue that tends towards green and the yellow that tends towards green, it's more of a straight green from a color wheel. Okay, so you can see this is the orange that was made with the colors that are kind of opposite. It's still made with red and yellow, but it's made with the ones that tend away towards each other. Whereas this is the orange made with the ones that tend towards each other. Same thing with these greens. This is the green that's made tend towards each other. This is the green that made tend away from each other. So they start to get a little bit browner. Now, there's nothing to say that this green is a bad green. It's just different than this green. It's a different kind of green. Same thing with the oranges. And so it's more just about knowing, again, what colors give you the mixing capabilities that you want. What colors give you the colors that you want. Let's also come back to here. So the yellow has dried. So you can kind of see how like you get an orange there, but it has sort of a different quality than that orange. Again, neither one is like better than the other. They just have different qualities. And we're gonna experiment with this kind of transparent layering in the first project, our first painting, the Dutch Still Life, which is a more traditional style of painting. And then as we get into other paintings, we're gonna kind of do more with like the actual mixing on the palette. But all of these skills are really important. So if you've got time, keep playing with mixing, with gradients, mixing on the palette, mixing on the paper. What are the different ways that you can control the brushes and control your edges, control the streakiness? Just play around with that. Play around with using your different mediums and see what they do. Play around with dry time, see what that does. Once you are done with a painting session, then you need to make sure you clean up the painting session. So again, these acrylic disposable pads are wonderful because you just tear it off. Oops. Okay. And then I just like to kind of fold it over to make sure, because the paint's still wet. I could let the paint dry and then tear it off, but if the paint's still wet, I want to fold it over so I'm not getting wet paint on other things, just including even the inside of the trash can. But then you can throw it away. And then you do need to make sure that you care for your brushes and your palette knife. Your palette knife, again, just you'll be able to see that you just want to wipe all the paint off of it. If it gets stained, that's not a big deal. Where a palette knife stops to be usable is if paint dries on it and makes it bumpy. This is a really old palette knife, but you want your palette knife to be kind of smooth, to have that hard edge, to be really usable for mixing paint and even applying paint later on. And then with brushes, what I like to do is, you'll notice my water is pretty gross. If your water starts to affect the color of your paint, then change your water halfway through the session. But at the end of a session, I kind of try to get as much paint off. And then I take the brushes and I take them to a sink, and under running water, I kind of let the water run, and I just use my fingers to kind of, and my fingernails, it actually helps clean out your fingernails, to like kind of go like this and make sure all the paint is out from the inside of the brush. Because when the paint gets inside of the brush, that's when the brush starts to get ruined. If you're struggling, if there's like a lot of paint stuck in there, then you can use some soap. Dish soap is great. Hand soap works great. You can buy fancy brush soap, but we're not going to bother with that. But yeah, if you're just in the bathrooms at college, just use the hand soap, and then make sure you rinse the hand soap out. So you want to make sure the water that's coming out of the brush is completely clean. And then you can just store your brushes and let them dry. I think that's everything for today. Again, the more that you can experiment with everything, play with areas where it's just fun to play, then the more confident you'll be going into the painting sessions where it really matters. All right, have fun.